Concealed within the mysteries of Kalachakra, the ancient inhabitants of Shambhala believed each god of our multiverse was a soul who had traversed 21,600 simultaneous lifetimes throughout multifarious histories, alternate realities, and timelines as multitudinous creatures and forms. All of these lives would occur within a given sphere of the space-time continuum, and when an individual would awaken to the ultimate truth, in all of these lives simultaneously, the thousand-petal lotus would unfurl, revealing the self as Vairocana Buddha, seated beneath the Bodhi tree, whose body consisted of 1,001 Buddhas, seated upon the 1,001 petals, which each contained 100 million worlds. Each of these petals feathered the scales of the cosmic feathered serpent, and this feathered serpent was known throughout all the ancient world. In Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, he proposed an idea he called the monomyth, which suggested that all stories are emanations of eternal recurrence, as each individual moves through various phases of growth as the hero of their own adventure in consciousness. The anomyth is the amalgamation of these adventures, as we, conscious evolving beings, are each the hero and god of our own personal universe, and each of our own unique stories feather the cosmic serpent as it expands infinitely into the void. Welcome to the Anomyth of Ipsis. For those who know a little bit more about me, you'll remember that in the year 2004, I contracted dengue fever, and in the process of actually bleeding out from it and nearly dying from it, I experienced some altered states of consciousness that I previously had no idea that they existed. And although I survived this event, this launched my mind into a scientific inquiry of the experiences that I experienced, the alternate dimensions and states of consciousness that I went into, and this led me towards deep curiosity, just in consciousness development, the evolution of consciousness in general, and specifically towards like psychedelic drug use and the fact that LSD 25 was used to throw open the doorways of perception and open all the doors into these alternate states. For the next few years after this, it's like I studied, psychedelic experiences and their use pretty extensively. I saw that the events that transpired in the 1960s, largely fueled by this spiritual awakening from the opening that occurred through this drug, led to a sense of unity, consciousness, and an awakening and enlightenment that we see manifested in our music, in our movies from that era, and our art, and the philosophies and the ideas, the way that the West bridged into Eastern philosophy, the way that Alan Watts was able to open the study of Eastern studies in Northern California, and the way that spread through the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, and the way this permeated into culture in such a deep way that this revolutionary front pretty much occurred. However, if you really examine the 1960s, you can see that the effects of this didn't take. Hunter S. Thompson talks about this as though a tremendous wave of consciousness, of power, of the energy of their love alone that they thought was going to triumph just basically broke and rolled back into the desert. It's like this entire era just disappeared, in the wake of Vietnam. And, since that time, there was a rampant return into a full-blown embrace of materialism, going back into a sort of like American ideal that has spread across the entire world. But to me, the most curious thing was that these experiences that these people had that didn't seem to anchor, that didn't seem to hold in their actual soul, was just because they, one, lack the techniques used in the East to develop and anchor themselves through, grounding, through meditation, through, the realization and anchoring of themselves in the self that Advaita Vedanta teaches. And I had a great curiosity as to what still lay beyond these doors. Like, if I threw these doorways open for myself, what would happen? So after years of literal research and reading, I decided myself to throw open this door. I spent, close to 7 years consuming a significant amount of LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, and felt that these two substances in particular, I experimented with some other things, but these two substances led to the greatest awakenings and the ability to actually retain the information, especially LSD. And I began an experiment in which I actually started to map my experiences on LSD directly onto the walls while I was experiencing them. And so the energies, the dimensions, the various interactions I was witnessing and experiencing within myself and in, ecstatic visions of the divine, of the, incredible, unified, multiversal, multi-dynamic expressions taking place in every single way, in every single place in our world. I began to actually be able to record these. And one, I found that my experiences actually coordinated directly into what is known as the Kala Chakra Tantra. For that reason, I traveled to India and was actually initiated into the Kala Chakra Tantra. And found that these energy systems, at least for the male system, were incredibly detailed and mapped and had been for centuries. And that their records, as far as at least one half of the equation, were very, very substantial. However, in putting the practice to use and to actually mapping what I was seeing and what I was experiencing, and the way that energy dynamics actually work, and the way that the flow of the currents and the dispenses of charges and the ionization of different energy fields within yourself worked, that we didn't actually have an accurate depiction. And in this, I actually found that the female system wasn't the way that, the 7 chakras mapped out. It didn't work exactly that way, because there had to be a flow. There's the white bodhicitta channel and the red bodhicitta channel, which combined form the central channel. This forms the pink bodhicitta, the pink elixir that runs through the central channel, that is essentially our anchor into the divine and also our source of life. The Taoists believe that if this red and white bodhicitta got mixed, or if they got imbalanced in any way, it would create, essentially draw in situations like accidents or occurrences of death or occurrences of injury or illness. And so they consciously paid attention to how to keep this balance exactly perfect, believing this was the key to their own immortality. However, in this perfect balance, in the neutrality, it zeroes out the entire system. And the manifestation of your actual will in this universe depends upon the ability to positively or negatively charge the energy field and what you're experiencing in order to create an event that causes change in a point in space and time. And so, having come to this understanding, I was seeking, essentially a unified theory to explain this. And this is when I first stumbled upon Thelema, which was Aleister Crowley's system based upon the ageless wisdom and the Hermetic practices, which also goes back for centuries in their records. And I actually found that exactly my experience as I mapped it out and how the universe worked coordinated quite directly into Aleister Crowley's own understanding of the universe and what is depicted in the Book of the Law, which is why I wrote Excalibur and why I feel this is so important. Because regardless of a few fundamental differences, the science actually matches it almost entirely. And so in this, we see that essentially we all exist in these series of systems, dimension systems, Like the human chakra system is one dimension, one sphere of consciousness of itself. And when it interacts with another sphere of consciousness, that quantum entanglement then creates the memories and creates the events in space and time, which allows the entire universal field to continue forward, the motion or hidit to continue and transform and change like a serpent shedding its skins, going entirely out, to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, which once when I was on ayahuasca, I actually literally witnessed a cosmic serpent with gears and with, like almost like the workings of a clock working itself over and over again. And within its scales, I saw like all the universes and all the stars and all of the different galaxies and everything working together as this giant clock within the scales of a serpent continuing on forever, which led me to investigate deeply even the Mayan sciences, which I've explored in the Animate of Ipsis, in which essentially using the records that Joseph Smith brought in correlation to a proper understanding of ancient wisdom and knowledge, we see that the Mayans were working on a cosmic scale, not a personal scale, which is why it's so hard for us to grasp their culture, why it seems so incredibly violent, because their sacrifices and everything were actually performing a sort of blood alchemy, in which they were attempting to change the forces of the cosmic scale of the universe to play their role in a much, much bigger way. And so through all of this, we can see that these systems, the individual system, which coordinates to the outer macrocosm, in which, a society, for example, is like an organism consisting of cells of individuals, just as the world consists as an organism full of cells of all of the living creatures upon it, just as a sun exists as an organism of all the planets and moons and asteroids and life forms that exist within its entire orbital field, which also coordinate down to cells and coordinate to atoms. And every 10 to the negative 22 or 10 to the 22, relation, you see the occurrence of a new macrocosm in relation to a microcosm. And these dimensions are built upon dimension and built upon dimension. And another one of the main reasons that we struggle to understand this is just because of our misunderstanding of time. We tend to see time as linear, but anyone who's studied quantum mechanics knows that time is not linear, time is spherical, which means that every point in space and time has already occurred on this sphere. And, your past is now, just as now is now, just as your future is now on these different points in space and time within certain dimensions and certain realities, which every single sphere then corks over, and every Vesica Pisces forms a vortex in which you transform and move into an alternate reality or alternate dimension, depending upon the scale of in and out that you're looking at. I mean, this completely smashes everything that we know in science, because science is looking at every single law just within one specific physical manifestation sphere, without taking into account that all of these spheres are playing a role and influencing our physical reality and changing it all the time. This is why they come to the conclusion that we live in a universe that seems to be working in perfect order, but also absolute chaos at the same time, because we're not taking into account the factor infinite and unknown. And in the coming videos and everything that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to show how these dimensions actually relate, the mathematics behind them, how we can relate this and actually use this in our own life. And so I'd recommend that you follow this page, that you check out my YouTube and follow that channel as well. And I am going to continue speaking along these lines, because I feel like the missing gap right now is people see spirituality as something that exists just kind of in spirit and not in matter. And everybody in the physical world tries to see it as like that's completely separate. But you have to take into mind that anything that exists, including whatever exists within a person's experience, exists in some way in this multiversal, multidimensional expression of life.